I'm pleased that we have with us for this closing session Professor Tommy J. Curry, who is on the faculty in philosophy and Africana studies at Texas A&M University. So pleased to have you.
Thank you.
Professor Curry, Tommy, if I may.
Please.
We are delighted to have this time with you as we close out our third annual meeting here in Fort Worth. I'll come back to the theme that we've been circulating in discussion, but I thought we would begin by asking you to make a kind of self-introduction.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, interests, struggles, whatever you are of a mind to talk to us about, and allow that to be a springboard for a few minutes of discussion about some issues we've talked about, and we'll come back at the end to the matter of our theme for the year, interpreters. And then we'll allow plenty of time for exchange with the circle of friends. Does that sound okay?
That sounds fantastic.
All right, tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you're wrestling with. What's going on?
So, for those of you who do not know, I think I've met mostly everyone. My name is Tommy Curry. I'm a professor in philosophy and Africana studies at Texas A&M. I come from Lake Charles, Louisiana. I am actually Southern. I deliberately came back to the South as a professor. I'm first generation. I am one generation removed from illiteracy. Brilliant people in my family, but people who were not allowed the same benefits of education that many black people were denied in the South during the period of time they were growing up. I was born in 1979. So my city didn't really desegregate till the mid-'80s. So I have very vivid memories of whites and colored-only kind of signs and signage. Because back then I tell people this story. It's like nobody believes it now, but there wasn't laser printing back like there is now. So there's this nasty white sticky tape that they used to put on windows, and after a while with the sun it would turn yellow. So when you remove it, you could still see the the letters. And there was an old Woolworth store, and my mom used to take me there to pick up things. And I remember it so vividly because I always wanted this red fire truck because they used to make them out of iron back then. But every time we would go in, there'd be an ice cream counter like at the old Woolworth stores, and it would say no colors. So I grew up for years as a child, especially it had to be about between 5 and 8 before they tore it down. And I have very vivid memories of that. So a lot of the ways that I think about the world is still framed in how I think about, what I constantly refer to in my work as segregational logics. Being first generation black and male in Lake Charles, there wasn't very many opportunities for you to see role models that were in education. I didn't see a black professor the whole time I was in Lake Charles. The men in my family were preachers, throughout. So intelligent men, men who certainly set me on the right path, emphasized the importance of education. But you don't see the same kind of representation as teachers, So my mom told me one day, she was like, you get your education because it's the one thing white people can't take from you. And I went all the way through as quickly as possible. So left from Lake Charles, I paid through college because I was a debater. Won a few national championships, was the first black person in this country to hold a national championship. So I was very proud of that. I was very young, but very proud of that. But that kind of conditioned me. It brought me into a world where, philosophy, critical race theory, reading, was something that I was kind of socialized in since I was in 12, 13 years old doing that. So I went to grad school, and I wanted to focus on black people. And it was one of the first times in my life where, moving out of the South, you recognize that even in the North, where things are supposed to be freer and better, there's an inferiority complex, not only amongst how some black people think about the relationship to other black people, but also in terms of how white people kind of manage and reward and incentivize black people. So when I got out, I said, well, look, I'm out now, I'm finished. I'm going to kind of start taking the world on in my own terms, writing critical race theory. I started, writing mostly on the work of Bell, when I saw to be the methodological problems of Africana thought, in philosophy. And there was such resistance, and I found it strange because, philosophy is a relatively conservative discipline,
Relatively.
Relatively, yeah. Black people aren't really accepted there. Black people, as we were just talking about, are more welcome for their political postures and their actual interventions into knowledge. So hiring, prestige, public, displays or support are measured more so on whether or not white philosophers can endorse the sentiment behind the work rather than the actual importance the work has for pushing fields forward. So I fell out of favor very quickly because I identified very structural things, citations, the ways in which all Africana thought seemed to always end at the same place, which is integrationism. There was no current conversations about any of the research that's going on that we know now with implicit bias, that we know with formative ability theories, et cetera. Everything seemed to rest on the idea that if you talk to white people long enough, they'll give you something or they'll change their minds. And I found that's not the best way to actually empower the minds of racialized peoples, right? They're confronting whiteness. They're not trying to, lull it to sleep, So I think that changed a lot. And over a few years, after I got tenure, I started taking up the problem of black men. And I thought that the reaction to some of the stuff I was doing on race and racism was bad. But when I started defending the humanity of black men, whole new problems emerged. Right? These ideas that black men could not be victims of certain kinds of violence, could not be victims of rape, could not be victims of domestic abuse, did not have a history of sexual violence and rape during slavery, should not be recognized in that way. It was just all these denials and the idea that someone could dare attack feminism for not paying attention to these previous kinds of abuses, allow people to levy certain kind of criticisms against me, being anti-woman, misogynist, et cetera, because my focus was on men. So in this constellation of things, my work has primarily been about why do black people take on and kind of interiorize some of the complexities of white supremacy? How does intraracial violence become a way to perpetuate genocidal logics amongst blacks, right? These are the questions that my research really take on. And last year, I was attacked by a white supremacist blogger who I think only has a bachelor's degree in journalism, who decided that he was going to take a phrase that I was using. I was talking about the movie Django. And I said that I was really disappointed. I mean, I still stand by what I said to this very day. I was disappointed that the way that we framed it was always in spectacle. That Django was a good movie because it was a spectacle of a black man being able to kill white slave owners, right? And I said that I have no problem with that aspect of how we look at it, but there's a historicity here. There's a history about the conversations of violence, revolutionary, and self-defense, and that I was disappointed that we hadn't contextualized the idea and the celebration of Django having the power to kill white people. Because the black slaves did not have that power, right? It wasn't just like you had the lone black male slave picking up guns, killing all the white people, and then riding away, with his beloved. It was a situation where lots of people died, right? Unlike white violence, the black violence has always led to casualties, and often has been exercised when everyone who emphasized violence died. So I made the comment that, we haven't grappled with the fact that, throughout history there's a tradition that some black people believe that in order to be free, some white people had to die, right? So he took just that snippet, not all the analysis that gets us there, and framed it as if this was, of course, the angry black guy saying, let's go kill all white people.
And I'm sure you said it quite quietly and in my voice, but that sparked the controversy.
That sparked the controversy
in Texas A&M. So some know that, I've said that I had discovered you through it was this extensive chronicle of higher education article.
Yes.
So it focused on your comment about violence on
Yes.
those terms. Could you say a bit more about, update us on what's going on at your school department and surroundings now?
Sure.
In terms of these kinds of issues?
Well, I mean, the department hasn't really made any specific issues related to race. It's been the general, we support academic freedom. I think the university, on the other hand, hasn't really dealt with the realities of how minority faculty and students feel. I think it's kind of a thing where they're like, oh, we'll just let it run its course. But you have lots of students, lots of faculty that now feel under attack. Because I think that when you have a kind of situation where a university literally throws its faculty under the bus and sides with white supremacists over blogs, who are writing on blogs, I mean, there's no way you can control these types of things. Then you run a very, very serious risks of not only freezing free speech, but actually demonizing it when it comes from specific groups that have historically been marginalized. And it's important to note that it's not just the way in which administrators are not defending their faculty, but it's the ways in which they're enabling violence. Because these threats are not coming just with, oh, we disagree. These threats are coming with, we'll kill you, we'll kill your family, things of that sort. So as a response to that, we had to leave the city. I pulled my daughter out of school 2 to 3 weeks early. So these are the types of actions that you have to be prepared to do when you're attacked by the alt-right. And the administration doesn't really see that as a negative. It's just kind of business as usual.
Do you have friends, colleagues in the department, other programs around the university
Yes,
support?
Yeah. I mean, I was very happy with the support from the department, but again, I think that, I mean, it's basically all white department, so I think that the way that it was processed was academic freedom. And that's not to say I don't appreciate the support, but that's a very different level. In Africana studies, it was immediately read as a racial attack, right? Because the question is, how does a full professor who has kind of somewhat of a national reputation, writing about political violence, writing about questions of armed self-defense, or even revolutionary violence, become dismissed or distanced for doing the work that they've been tenured for? And the important thing to note, this isn't, I mean, I publish on this stuff. Right? I've published pieces on revolution, I've published pieces on armed self-defense, and the irony is that most of my work now looks at the militant armed civil rights tradition, because that's been the dominant tradition that black people have utilized and spoken through in the United States. But the academic aspect doesn't protect you from the, fanaticism of white supremacists. Because the idea is that any attempt by black people, any attempt by any people that are not white to defend themselves from white violence becomes akin to violence. And I think that says something very interesting and scary about the world that we're in right now. That this is, if we're talking about, mid-20th century, there'd be questions of self-determination, that certain groups still don't have the right of self-determination, that you can't protect yourself from very visible threats. And, this comes not only in the sense of silencing speech or scholarship, but this comes in the fact that if you say something that's unpopular, we'll kill you. I mean, this is what's being empowered by universities today. And these conversations are accumulating around questions of race, specifically blackness, and of course, in terms of religion, Islam, and immigrant status. So part of the project of the ethno-nationalism, the ethno-nationalist backlash that we see under Trump, is kind of a cleansing effect of any kind of perspectives or paradigms that will challenge the ideology of white supremacy. And that's extremely dangerous, because what we're dealing with, I tell people all the time, I tell them, I was like, the problem that we have with how we talk about race and racism now amongst black people is that we've trained generations of scholars to focus on inequality. We've constantly focused on how are we missing, what is it, what biases, what forms of knowledge have we missed that aren't allowed us to fulfill the civil rights goals, right? And we've had tons of scholars that have taken this approach. Even when you're talking about critical race theory in education, or if you're talking about contemporary theories that are looking at Afro-pessimism, these things focus on identity, discourse, these small, gaps in grammar, right? But that's not what white people are talking about. That's not what white supremacists are talking about. White supremacists are talking about how do you build a white republic that's been poisoned by racial and ethnic diversity. right? The brute fact of their ideology is, how do you rebuild a white supremacist society when you have religions like Islam, ethnicities like Mexicans, and citizens like black people? And that's what their violence is being used to do. So we fundamentally misunderstood, because the way we talk about race is not based in a civil disagreement. It's not about civil rights. The way that we're talking about race now is based on civilizational discourse. What culture, what civilization, and what land is going to define the values for the rest of the world to the next century? And that's a vastly different perspective that we've been trained in. That's a perspective you get in the 1900s. That's what you get when people are talking about the yellow peril, the black peril, the white peril. Because they're arguing about what happens when white bodies come in contact with inferior racialized beings. But we haven't trained people to think that way. We thought that was dead. We thought the civil rights movement and desegregation was a turning point in how we thought about race relations. And now we come back to find, oh my God, these ethnological theories that we thought were merely misunderstandings of cognitive bias are actually still alive and well. Which is why they want their monuments. When you read white philosophers like Josiah Royce, this is where I wrote a book on him, he tells you how to build a white supremacist society. And here's the crazy thing, is that you have philosophers championing Royce because they're like, oh, he's talking about communities and beloved communities and memorials and loyalty to loyalty. And I read it, I was like, this guy's giving you an architecture of a white supremacist society. He's telling you, if you build a community, build monuments so foreigners come in and worship the monuments and take on your culture. It says if you want people to be part of your community, they have to lose their culture and language. It tells you how to deal with black people. His arm was colonized black people in the South. Hello. You know, it's a program that's written in the 1900s that you see constantly reimagined and reinforced in various logics that we take on today. And instead of us pointing that out, we still have these conversations about identity, which is why I'm so critical about a lot of the work that's coming out with the pretense of radicality, or the pretense of true reflection on race and racism in America. Right? It's a dereliction of our duty, so to speak, to seriously investigate what's the underpinnings of white supremacy. And I don't say that in terms of the cliche, right? You know, we say terms so much now that they don't have any meaning. When I'm saying white supremacy, I'm talking about all the concurrent logics that accompany the presence of white people in America, that allow them to constantly position themselves not only voices of authority, but as also agents to direct certain histories and civilizational discourses towards their own superiority. These white people who are in the streets shooting at people, these white people who are in the streets saying we're going to vote for Trump, or we have voted for Trump, and we want him again. These people are still agents. We can think they're ignorant, but the world is moved by ignorant people, because those ignorant people are the first to die in wars that change the direction of history. And instead of us understanding that, because we're much too civilized and tame now to ever believe that bodies and violence actually changes things, we're still having conversations of how to negotiate with people who see themselves as indifferent at best and reformers at worst, right? I'm talking about white liberals here. In terms of how they mediate this world. Right? Violence is becoming the rule of the day. We're accepting death threats against professionals. We're accepting white supremacists with AR-15s marching the streets, and we're protecting them. We laugh at what Trump's doing in the White House, but come on, Trump is empowering and offering a discourse and political platform to the KKK, neo-Nazis and fascists. And we have not caught up in our thinking yet. You know, and I think that's what kind of alienates a lot of my work from other people, is because the criticism is not just on the routine aspects of white supremacy or paleoconservatism. It's also about how the intellectual projects that we hold don't have any power because they haven't really identified the problem and the motivations behind this resurgence.
Well, it's kind of hard for us to see how you could alienate anybody.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
Let me ask you, it's sort of a side question
Sure.
that I want to use as a bridge to get to this issue of interpreters. So your institution is a state, obviously
Yes.
a well-known state, well-heeled, endowed state institution.
It is.
Do you think, it's sort of a minor question for as a bridge, do you think the response or responses, the whole situation would be different in a different kind of school. I mean, I don't necessarily mean out of Texas, but I mean non-state institution. I think it's land grant.
Yeah, it's a land grant institution.
Because there's something about, I mean, it's sort of worth thinking about how the legitimacy, the linkage to the state in this respect may condition or embolden certain responses.
Oh, no, absolutely, yes.
You work for us.
Right.
And you're supposed to comport yourself this way, orient yourself on certain terms. Right. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm trying to get at
makes sense.
What the psychologics of the parties affiliated with state institutions.
Yeah. Well, I think
may
to a certain extent A&M is a little different because of conservatism there, right? It is a conservative university, and it was one of the first stomping grounds when people like Richard Spencer and other white supremacists wanted to come recruit and wanted to spread their message. I think that given the political parties, that they're extremely comfortable, if not constituted by many of the alt-right ideologues. So I think that puts it in a unique position, right? Because it has support for kind of trying to stomp out anti-racist, anti-white supremacists.
And you have to give voice to everybody.
Right. Because I mean, see, notice how academic freedom, is used in that case. I mean, some of the work that was done was you have this group called the Texas Ags, and they did, it's an open record state, so they released some of these things. You can see various people, some administrators, some people, communities, celebrating that, my claim to self-defense was the same as Richard Spencer's claim to white supremacy, right? And see, this is the false parallel, the false equivalency here. That a black man that says black people have a right to defend themselves from white supremacists is the same as a white supremacist, right? And I don't know if anyone's heard the speech or the transcripts up all across the internet if you're really curious. But what's fascinating about it is that the whole speech is about how we have similar situations today of white vigilantism, white people arming themselves, right? The cops coming into black and brown neighborhoods and and police them, surveilling them. And I simply said that the Second Amendment gives black people the right to protect themselves, the same way that it does for any other group. And that was so outrageous, right? Because in the talk I actually say that anytime black people actually speak about defending themselves from white violence, they're accused of advocating violence. And the exact same thing literally happened, right? And it's funny because there's comments on the web, they're like, Curry is making the point, like you're making Curry's point, that if he talks about self-defense against violence, you're going to accuse him of advocating violence. And this is what's fascinating to me, is that, it puts you in a position that it really highlights, what we see as the problem in the Black Academy. Because we can't both accept that there's repression of thought and then keep lifting up the thought that's coming out as if it's the best and the most exemplar black thought. If we're not having conversations about freedom that involve political violence, either as being imposed or as reacting against that imposition, then we're not really having conversations about the history of liberation throughout the world. Every liberation movement has utilized some form of violence. That doesn't mean it's mass genocide going out just killing everybody. But it means self-defense, it means guerrilla warfare, tactics, boycott, right? There's some imposition of force. And I think that the school,
I was just going to say that, but what's pretty astounding here is that it's made clear you are not given the freedom to explore certain topics, certain issues, nor given the range of possibilities that a free-thinking person should normally, naturally have, to range widely. What if black people were to
Exactly.
take up arms to
Exactly.
liberate themselves
Right.
in
is it
South
called?
Texas or
Exactly.
wherever.
Right,
you know.
exactly.
So, this touches on, here I want to pivot here because I know colleagues are anxious to chime in. So, our theme interpreters. So that may not be the language you've been playing with, but you've nonetheless touched on it throughout your conversation with us here so far. So it strikes me that it's what struck me about the Chronicle of Higher Ed article is that I said, they don't want him to play. They're not. They want him to play on a very small, limited field. He can't move out in this direction. He can't even opine about possibilities, in the life. So there's a sense in which it seemed to me you were being constructed as an interpreter on someone else's terms, and rather narrowly so. And there's nothing new about that.
Right.
Although seeing it, having this be in the High Academy's journal this way, happening in at this point 2017, was really quite disturbing. You would think, subtlety, yes, but really,
no,
you can't talk about,
you can't talk, exactly.
can't talk about this.
Exactly.
There's no way. So quite disturbing, and so we resonate with your thinking about these issues insofar as we've been taking up the issue of the interpreter, who constructs the interpreter, who shapes the interpreter, by what authority are you made a high interpreter in this or that setting. I hope that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense.
That's
I mean, I'm actually
conversation.
No, I'm actually a fan of Bowman. But is that
You got it.
it's you remember that piece in his book, Legislation in Terms, where he's talking about why we can't see the new poor, right? Why we can't see them, because the academy is structured in such a way that the way that we perceive poverty can never imagine the people that actually possess it, but we have the kind of limited interaction with what we take to be the negation of our situation, right? Because we're middle class intellectuals, we're bourgeois, so we utilize tools that say, the things that are negations, like not having access to certain services, not having access to X, Y, and Z. But the new poor, the people who are at the bottom of the wretched, right? These people, right? They're devoid of humanity too. They're devoid of the very possibility of recognition. So, and this is why Sylvia Winters picks up his work, right?
Yeah.
Sylvia Winters picks his work up in this sensibility, which he's talking about. So, you ask yourself when you ask this question, what is the limitation? Is that the thought resonates from a group of people. It's the kind of thinking that resonates or is voiced from a group of people that are fundamentally at the bottom. It is for black people, especially black people who are Southern, to speak about the possibilities of political liberation through violence is so far out of the bourgeois conceptualization of knowledge production, right? Because you're actually threatening not only the order of knowledge, because the order of knowledge suggests we're all rational, right? Discourse is the way that we assimilate knowledge, right? And that the assimilation of knowledge thereby leads to better behaviors, right? Because we're rational, moral individuals. And for someone to say, well, you're not rational, or if you are rational, then your reason is fundamentally morally corrupt, right? Because it constantly reproduces racism. That your investment in the status quo is not ignorance, but your substantiation of violence to keep social order. And that people who are oppressed by that social order may need to take up arms militantly to break it. So that's what they have a problem with. The issue, they want to frame it as white genocide, but the issue, when I write about violence, my argument is that violence ruptures the ontology of whiteness, which is thought to be invulnerable to black action, black agency, right? This is what Ida B. Wells talks about. The idea is that a white life is superior to a black life. So white lives will never risk being extinguished by black people, right? They think of themselves as gods. So the idea, that's why there's these harsh punishments. If a black person kills a white person, you already know what's going to happen. Because that's something that we could never allow to happen. The social order is built on that fabric. And here you have a guy saying, well, what if black people took up arms to protect themselves from white vigilantes? Right? What if white life becomes contingent? Right? These are the questions that my research asks. Like, how does that fracture the ideas of whiteness? Because remember, what makes black people, what makes immigrants, what makes Muslims or who they deem terrorists vulnerable is that it takes the white individual takes on the power to decide who lives or dies. Because that's what violence does. That's what political violence does. It arbitrates who should live or die.